Another idea that lay people often have is that until the welfare state was created, people who were destitute were helpless. They had no one to assist them in hardship, or when they were sick or too old to work or otherwise unable to care for themselves. And this is the worst kind of myth. It was never, ever, as far as we know anything about human beings, never the case that people who were too old to care for themselves or too sick or hurt and unable to take care of themselves were simply abandoned and thrown to the wolves. That is not the nature of human beings. So when people were in hardship, where did they get their help? Well, they got it mainly from their relatives, from their kinfolk. They got it from neighbors, from people who belonged to the same church or other private association they were connected with. So people used their civil associations and their familial associations as sources of assistance during times of hardship. And there was nothing extraordinary about this, but people didn't think for centuries of the family as a welfare institution. That is just what families did. People cared for their relatives. Well, the family has weakened over time, and that was one of the reasons why proponents of the welfare state thought that we needed a welfare state. That they argued very often that the family relationships that people had depended upon earlier were no longer reliable, that families were too unstable, they were too split up by migration or other movements that tore family members apart from one another and made it more difficult for them to look after each other. And so the state, in a sense, they thought had to step into the gap. But as it turned out, even if that were to some extent the case, once the state started stepping in to fill the gap, it also had the effect of crowding out the remaining voluntary efforts to take care of people. It then became easier for relatives to say, oh, my brother's in trouble, but I don't need to help him, the state will help him. My parents are too old to work, but I don't need to care for them because the state will give them a pension. My cousin is sick, I don't need to care for him because the state has sickness insurance, health insurance. And so even if the argument had some validity in the first place, once the welfare state was created and began to operate, it had the effect of crowding out voluntary efforts. Now, obviously, it never completely crowded those efforts out, because a great many of them still occur today. There are many, many private organizations of various kinds, some church-related, some related to unions and ethnic associations and a whole variety of groups that help their members out in times of hardship. But it's also still the case that family members assist one another, and the family remains the most important social unit. You see this, for example, in the extreme cases like the countries that adopted communism. The communists tried to eliminate all intervening organizations, all these private organizations that had grown up over the centuries, including those associated with the churches. They tried to destroy. They tried to create a situation in which individuals were connected to the mighty nation state, and nothing stood between the two. And that included the family, because the communists did such despicable things as encourage family members to act as informants to the police against one another. And this is one of the most horrifying aspects of life under communism. I've spoken to a number of people who lived in Central Europe or in Russia, about the fact that you couldn't trust anybody except your closest family members. One woman I knew used to describe how she and her mother and father, who lived in an apartment, would go to the side of the apartment to talk about certain things because they knew that on the other side of the apartment was a neighbor who listened to them through the wall with a stethoscope. Imagine living like that. This is horrifying. Of course, this happens now to us without the stethoscope because we have the NSA and the FBI and all the rest of these electronic snooping agencies that watch our every move and don't require the presence of a human being to act as an informant. We're all informing on ourselves if we have a phone in our pocket. And yet we're so accustomed to this technology that it doesn't occur to us that we're in almost the same position as people lived in under communism in the USSR, watched at all times, monitored, our words recorded, our messages recorded, our mail photographed, our checks and credit card transactions photographed and recorded and placed in gigantic databases linked to one another so that whenever some authority wants to call up information on us, 1 or 2 clicks tells him everything there is to know about us. That's a horrifying world, and we're living in it right now. But that's an aside. Meanwhile, back at the birth of the welfare state, we can actually go back to the 16th century in England, because we're talking in this session about the United States, and the origins of this country lie in the English colonists who came here in the 17th, 18th centuries and set up colonies that later formed the United States of America. When these English people came over, they brought with them the full set of English customs and practices. And one of those customs was the system of poor relief that we can trace back to several statutes enacted in the 16th century, first under the Tudors and especially under Elizabeth I, the Queen of England for a long time in the 16th century. These laws can be traced further back to labor shortages after the Black Death, to the existence of many beggars wandering around in England and other parts of Europe without employment. Some of these people unable to work, some unable to find work, but reduced to begging. And there was little tolerance for begging in England, and probably little tolerance on the continent as well. But at all events in England, beggars were treated as criminals, basically. They were punished, and they were sometimes killed for a second offense. Gradually, the severity of the system lightened somewhat, but it remained severe to the very end. The idea was that people didn't want to support anyone who wasn't working to support himself if it were at all possible for that person to work to support himself. Now, under the system of poor relief in England, there were two different kinds, one called indoor relief and another outdoor relief. In outdoor relief, a person lived somewhere on his own but could receive food and perhaps some clothing from the local parish officials. The whole system was organized at the parish level. The parish, of course, is an ecclesiastical unit of jurisdiction, but in England there was a state church, so the civil government and the religious government were actually one and the same, and many state functions were carried out by the church authorities or by churchmen themselves. Indeed, the whole system of the poor laws, as it came down after the 16th century, was an upshot of Henry VIII's declaring the Church of England independent from the Catholic Church headed by the Pope in Rome. And when he did that, he plundered the church And that included plundering the monasteries. And the monasteries had been the principal dispensers of assistance to people who were unable to take care of themselves. So he had destroyed these previous providers of help, and so something had to be devised to put in place of the old monastery system. So what was put was the parish system of assistance, operated by churchmen and local officials, and funded by a local tax, which was usually called the poor rate, a tax on people's land values for the most part. People didn't like paying the poor rate, and they wanted to keep it as low as they could. And one way to do that was to keep the number of poor people being cared for as low as possible. And they thought the best way to do that was punish people who were asking for assistance, make it even risky for them to come forth and ask for assistance. Sometimes people were whipped, but at all events, they were never welcomed with open arms. So if you ever think like, some of these right-wing Republicans are callous about the welfare system, well, at least they don't anymore propose to give floggings or execute people who go on welfare. So that's some progress. The poor system came over to the United States, or to the colonies that became the United States, in a little different form, because the parish organization of civil government didn't exist here. Organized churches didn't exist everywhere, and at all events we had a more reliance here on civil government and less on church government. So the system of local relief, such as it was, and it wasn't much, existed at the county level and on an ad hoc basis at the municipal level. Cities and towns might, if there were some extreme case of distress, perhaps the town had been flooded, or some terrible epidemic had struck, or something out of the ordinary had taken place and a lot of people needed help, then a town might provide temporary meals or foodstuffs. But this was not something that was done routinely or chronically. It was extraordinary, and the counties became the units where destitute people were cared for. And in this case, they were mostly cared for with indoor relief. That is, they were sent to the county poorhouse, as it was called. And it must have been called that for a long time, because when I was growing up, my parents used to speak of the threat of going to the poorhouse. So at least the term was still around. And that was to put the fear of God in us to work. You better get in gear, you'll end up in the poorhouse, was the threat. But the counties did have these places where poor people were housed and taken care of. And often these people were not even able to work at all. They were crippled, they were old, they were mentally unfit, or in some other way just simply couldn't take care of themselves. So in some cases there wasn't any great question about whether they could support themselves or not. They obviously couldn't. And if they had no relatives about to support them, or they had no friends or neighbors willing to undertake the task, then they were not allowed to simply die. Even if the government, which wasn't interested in doing this, had to be the ones taking care of them. So this dying in the gutter story that we hear every once in a while, at least as a term of speech, is completely a myth. There was no abandonment of destitute people ever.